Well, they say three times the charm, third time's the charm, so let's see. Okay, there have been some power issues. Apparently, power keeps blinking and my modem keeps resetting, which means I keep losing my connection through my phone. So hopefully, everything will stay up and running for a little while, so I can do this. Um, to start again, uh, we're here talking about the second of my books, Campfire Stories, an anthology. Although more properly, it's a collection. An anthology is more than one author. Um, Campfire Stories is a collection of 8 stories published in 2013. It contains almost all the shorter fiction I had completed to that point, with the exception of 3 stories, With Eyes Open and Voice in the Darkness, which are both included in the first book, With Eyes Open, and a story titled A God to Dance With, which is included in the next book, A Bright Symmetry. With the exception of the final story, The Shape of the Truth, all the stories had been submitted at various times over the years, some of them multiple times. 3 of them did see publication online. Signpost in 2005, All My Yesterdays Remembered in 2009, and Symmetry in 2010. And that was it. Now, I'm not saying that there's any connection to it, but all 3 of those magazines did go under not long after publishing my stories. Not saying there's a connection, but anyway, it was the that lack of success, that lack of interest, and just getting tired of editors sending back form letters saying it's good, but we don't need it right now. Okay, I've sent it to you 5 times. When is going to be the right time? So it was that lack of success that led me to abandon traditional publishing and take on the life of an independent author and start self-publishing. But that's a topic for another day. The stories are arranged not in the order that I wrote them, but in the order that they occur in my fictional universe. All my stories take place in the same universe with one consistent timeline. The history of this slightly different from our own universe starts about 13.8 billion years plus 1 day in the past and stretches, for now, to about the year 7968. Because the stories take place in one timeline, stories that take place in about the same era tend to have intermingling of characters. A character that quote unquote guest stars in one story could be the quote unquote star of his or her own story. Who am I kidding? It's usually going to be her story. There are also immortals, vampires, and werewolves that exist in my fictional universe, and of course live for centuries and have a tendency to change names. Now, before I go any further, I just want to say that I tried very hard when I was putting my notes together to not divulge too many details, but putting together a brief synopsis of the stories, I kind of had to. So, from here on out, to quote River Song, spoilers. Now, the stories. The collection starts off with The End of Seconds, which is set a long time ago, 13.8 billion years plus 1 day ago. In the aftermath of a failed time travel experiment, the universe previous to this one comes to an end. There is one survivor, an observer named Aricia Mastani. Existing as a being of pure energy, Aricia releases the energy that had destroyed her home universe, giving rise to the new one. Now, I had been toying with this idea for a long time, going all the way back to sometime in the 80s when I first watched Carl Sagan's Cosmos, because the very first line of the very first episode is the cosmos is all that is or ever was or ever will be. But I always found myself wondering, yeah, but what came before? Also, if you go to the Bible, right there, page 1, it says, "And God said, let there be light." Well, where did God come from? I've always wondered that. I mean, I was raised Catholic, and I was always taught you don't ask such questions, but I always ask such questions. So I was looking at it from the point of view of what if God initiated the Big Bang, and then just kind of stepped back, and that's the basis of the story. I wasn't trying to I wasn't trying to be too heavy-handed with it. I hope I wasn't. It actually is kind of a almost Hindu thing, because the way it's described in the stories, there's almost a series of universes, one after the other, after the other, after the other. One dies, another one is reborn from it, rising like the phoenix from the ashes. And so it just keeps going on and on and on and on. Excuse me. The elixir of life. And then the second story is called Games of Life and Cold, which is set in an unknown time in the past. I never figured out exactly when it takes place because it doesn't deal with any human characters. Well, characters that only look human. A group of genetically engineered explorers known as Sentinels, or in their own language, Zendharna, explore an uninhabited planet. Their exploration is interrupted by the arrival of the Skadikians, a race that believes itself to be superior to every other race. And no, they don't look like little pepper pots with plungers for arms and scream exterminate. This is probably as close to a horror story as I've ever gotten, because I do some really nasty things to one of the characters. Originally, I had planned this to be the first of a series of stories about the Sentinels. I have a whole long history of how they went from being just a group of genetically engineered explorers to, hi April, to almost a warrior culture, but that never went through. It kind of languished, and now I've moved on to other things, and my universe has changed so much I don't know if they actually are going to fit in it anymore. But one of these days, maybe I'll be able to tell some more stories about them. Excuse me. Excuse me. Okay. Third story, titled "If You Listen Softly," which is set in 2005. A writer wakes up to find an unknown woman in bed with him. The problem is, he's lived alone since the death of his wife, and he went to bed by himself. To further complicate things, he's the only one who knows who the woman is. There are a couple of stories in Campfire Stories that I tried to evoke kind of a Twilight Zone feeling to them. In fact, even in the story itself, the character does reference Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone. I was just basically looking at the nature of reality, and how the concept of nature abhors a vacuum, doesn't like empty spaces or holes, and what nature, if you will, Mother Nature, quote unquote, would do to fill an empty space that shouldn't be there. Then probably the most biographical of my stories is the next one, titled "All My Yesterdays Remembered," which is set in 2009. Author Tom Stengel welcomes his lifelong friend Lisa Stennis home for their 20-year high school reunion, and she reveals to Tom and his wife Bonnie that she's immortal. A lot of the main character's background comes from my own past, moving from New York, Bronx, New York, to Long Island, growing up in the suburbs and watching the March of Urban Blight and all that. And basically, it was just to look at the question: how well do you know anybody? I mean, we all have friends that we've known for years, and sometimes friends we've known our whole lives. But do you really know them as well as you think you do? Hmm? And just to drop a little teaser here, the story of Lisa Stennis is not finished. And the third story, which is the third story set more or less in present day, is titled Symmetry, which is set in 2010. Rosalind Hart wakes up to find herself in a subway car passing through an unnaturally dark and long tunnel. She has no idea how she got on a subway or who the train's conductor really is. Life-altering changes lead Rosalind to take the place of death. This is another quasi-Twilight Zone story, another look at maybe there is more to reality than we know. Also does assume that there is a physical manifestation of death, and that death is actually a position that is held, similar to something Piers Anthony, for example, explored in his novel on a Pale Horse. The subway car substituting the boat, the tunnel, the river Styx. And again, just another look at how the real world might not be everything that we think it is. Basically, it boils down to what would happen if the personification of death wanted to leave his position. Now we start moving into the future, which is actually better for me. I have trouble setting stories in present day because I'm not the fastest writer around. So dealing with stories set in the real world, having to accommodate real world events, is kind of hard. For example, I have a project titled Upon a Far Distant Shore. It's my vampire novel that I've been working on now since 2008. Yeah. It was supposed to be finished by 2012. It's not. It's about 2/3 of the way through, but the problem I'm dealing with is, do I change the days of the date the novel takes place, or do I just let it go and let the readers figure out when it takes place? I'm not certain. I'll deal with that when I finish it. Anyway, back to Campfire Stories. The next story, I make a few assumptions that technological advancement happens pretty quickly, because the next story, Signpost, is set in 2114, and at that point humanity has started building starships. We've figured out how to travel faster than light, and we're starting to take our first steps out into the universe. On a survey mission to an uncharted, uninhabited world, the exploration cruiser Firefox finds signs pointing to a legendary race known as the Mengarans. Their chief contact officer, Commander Tamara Bowron, discovers the fate of the Mengarans and hints at what might be the future of humanity. One of the questions that people that are out there: are we alone in the universe? Now, the universe is 13.8 billion years old. There's plenty of time for other races to have arisen. What would it be like for the first race the very first race to evolve and reach intelligence. What would it be like? What would they be like after billions of years? Which is where the Mengarans are at the point the story takes place. They've evolved beyond the point of even having physical bodies. And at that point, it's like, okay, well, there's all these other races, and they're dumb as rocks, you know, compared to them. I mean, it's like us trying to have a conversation with an ant. You know, you can talk to them all you want, and they're just not going to do anything. Unless they're a fire ant, then they'll bite you. The next story, we travel farther into the future, called Last Light, set in 2189. And with this story, I introduce the concept of the enhanced humans. By about 2170, late 22nd century, genetic science has perfected the ability to custom make humans, and they started what's known as the Enhanced Human Project, which generally produces humans genetically designed to be stronger, faster, smarter, better, sharper senses. They're generally produced in batches of 50, about 1,000 a year, and about half to 2/3 of them are essentially slaves. They are the hate group of the late 22nd century. Humanity has figured how not to hate itself because of religion, race, whatever. Now they just hate the race that they created, or at least part of it. And it's also the first introduction of EarthGov security, which, as much as many don't like it, I believe there is going to have to be a world government, at the very least, to administer colonies and negotiate contracts with extraterrestrials, because they're not going to come here and want to negotiate 192 separate treaties. They're going to talk. Okay, they're going to say, okay, who speaks for Earth? To quote again Carl Sagan. So that's why I have EarthGov. The nations as we know them today more or less still exist in the late 22nd century. So, Special Agent Carolyn Adrastia becomes involved in a hostage crisis. Though she tries to end the standoff without injury, the hostage taker is killed and Agent Adrastia is injured. Excuse me. No, Carly's not killed. Carly's one of my favorite characters. This story was originally supposed to be part of a larger work, On a Cold Wind, which is actually book 6. It didn't really fit with the rest of the story. I had to do a lot of almost gymnastics trying to make this story fit in with the rest of it. So I decided to pull it out and just leave it standing on its own. Hostage situation. It's not exactly the most original idea I've ever had, but as an introduction to Carly, the other characters in her world, and EarthGov security, it's not bad. Okay, then there is the last story of the collection, which is the longest one, titled The Shape of the Truth, which is set in 2196. While visiting friends on Argosy Station, contract investigator Dari Locke is hired by Confed security to track down a fugitive, a member of a race of shapeshifters known as the Children of Leja. Dari has to deal with prejudice and knowledge that the fugitive is also a member of her race. Excuse me. My allergies are acting up, so sorry. If I'd have thought about it, I'd taken Claritin before this, but okay, this was also supposed to be part of a larger work. I haven't gotten back to it. I'm still working some details out about it because it essentially involves killing 50,000 of Dari's people, and well, I got to figure out how that happens. This also points out that there are two separate governmental bodies, in at least in my fictional universe. There's the Earth Administration, which is Earth and all its colonies, and then there's Confed, which is short for Confederation, which is kind of like the Federation in Star Trek, for example. It's a quasi democracy made up of about 130 something worlds. Earth is an affiliate member. I don't know if they actually have a vote, but they are part of Confed. That's why that's referred to as Confed security, not EarthGov security, because it's Confed security that hires Dari, not Earth. And Dari Locke and her people are actually my attempt at making shapeshifters. I've always been fascinated by shapeshifters, going all the way back to the second season of Space 1999, and the character of Maya was one of the high points of a rather dismal second season, but we won't go there right now. And also Odo from Deep Space Nine. Now, as much as I like both those characters, a lot of things bothered me about both of them. First of all, any kind of anything they had with them, like their electronic devices or things like that, always changed with them. How did that happen? Looking at Odo, for example, he had on his chest a Bajoran comm badge, and it always changed when he did. Okay, he could probably duplicate the shape of the badge, but could he duplicate the electronics, and where's the power source coming from? The other thing that bothers me about shapeshifters, as they're generally portrayed, is they can become anything, any size, any shape. And that kind of bothered me, because I remember many times in Space 1999, for example, Maya, who's an adult woman, turns into something really small, like a little white mouse, and I think once she turned into a caterpillar. Where's all that mass going? And same thing with Odo. I remember once he turned into a glass, which then broke. It's like, didn't that hurt? Anyway, so my shapeshifters have a limit on how big or small they can be, based on their own mass. You know, like us, there are different sizes. As you grow older, you get a little bit bigger. As you're, when you're younger, a little bit smaller. Also address the fact that there are some members of her race that can't shapeshift. That's the character of Maya in the story. Excuse me. That's the character of Maya in the story. There's a small percentage of Dari's race that can't change shape. And what do? At its base, it's a detective story of Dari, who is a detective, or as it's referred to in the late 22nd century, contract investigator. And an interesting thing about this, when I was still working on it, I put part of it up on fictionpress.net just to try and get some feedback on it. And there's a scene where Dari goes up to a vendor to get something to drink. She feels like somebody's watching her. The vendor asks what's wrong. She says, I felt like somebody's watching me. And the vendor in that original draft says, I can certainly see why. And that's not his response now. But somebody read that and then proceeded to tear me a new one, carrying on about misogyny is alive in the late 22nd century, and how Dari should have turned around and walked away, should have cursed him out, turned around and walked away, and then grew an arm out of her back and flipped him off. It's like, did you read the story? Did you read the rest of it? That's not exactly Dari's character. Her people tend to try and go unnoticed, so she's not going to do something like grow an arm out of her back to flip somebody off. I hope to one day soon get back to Dari's story, because it is I think an interesting concept, and hopefully one day I'll be able to get back to it. But I have a lot of other projects I have to finish first. I'm just moving from one partially finished story to the next. Well, that brings us to the end of the of the stories. Um, I I'm not a fast writer, so I do tend to have a long time between projects. Ironically enough, now I do have two projects in the editing phase. One of which I have to start right after I finish this. It's called Raven. It's another EGS story. Um, so, like all the books, they are available on through Smashwords, Amazon for both ebook and pr- ebook and print, iTunes, Nook, CreateSpace. If you're just looking for print on demand, $5.99 for the ebook, $7.99 for the print book, and all of them are available through my website, Word Boys Words. It's wordboy1.wixsite.com/wordboy. I'll put that down in the comments section. So I guess that's it for now. We'll be back in 2 weeks to talk about the next book, A Bright Symmetry, and how you don't need chapters. You just need stories. So thanks for watching, and talk to you soon. Bye.